On the 4th of July, 1944, while Americans across the nation celebrated Independence Day with fireworks and parades, a small gray tabby kitten entered the world aboard a United States Navy attack transport somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean. The crew had no way of knowing that this tiny creature, born amid the sounds of diesel engines and the smell of salt air, would become one of the most decorated felines in American military history. They named her Pooli. This is the story of a cat who earned 3 service ribbons and 4 battle stars. A cat who witnessed some of the most brutal amphibious operations of the Pacific War. A cat who stood beside sailors as they faced kamikaze attacks, naval bombardments, and the terror of bringing soldiers into the jaws of enemy fire. But more than that, this is a story about the bond between warriors and the animals who share their fate, about survival in the worst conditions humanity can create, and about the small comforts that keep men sane when surrounded by death. The Pacific War in 1944 was reaching its climax. American forces were island-hopping across thousands of miles of ocean, each landing more costly than the last. The Japanese defenders, knowing they faced defeat, fought with increasing desperation. Into this maelstrom sailed the attack transports of the United States Navy, ships designed for one of the most dangerous missions in naval warfare, delivering assault troops directly onto hostile beaches. Attack transports were the workhorses of the Pacific Amphibious Campaign. Designated with the hull classification APA, these vessels were typically converted cargo ships or passenger liners, refitted to carry a full battalion of troops along with their equipment, supplies, and the landing craft needed to get them ashore. They were cramped, uncomfortable, and relatively lightly armed for their size. Their mission required them to approach enemy-held shores, lower their landing craft under fire, and then remain offshore as floating command posts and casualty evacuation centers while battle raged on the beaches. The crews of these ships knew their vessels were targets. Japanese coastal artillery, aircraft, and submarines all sought to sink the transports before they could deliver their human cargo. Even after the initial assault waves departed, the ships remained vulnerable as they waited to evacuate wounded, take on prisoners, and prepare for the next operation. It was dangerous, grinding work that demanded months at sea, frequent combat, and constant vigilance. Into this world came Pooli, likely the offspring of another ship's cat, born in the cramped crew quarters or perhaps in a quiet corner of the cargo hold. Ship's cats had been part of maritime tradition for centuries, originally valued for their ability to hunt the rats and mice that plagued wooden sailing vessels. By World War II, ships were made of steel and vermin control had become less critical, but cats remained aboard for another reason: they were good for morale. Life aboard a warship in the Pacific was a special kind of hell. Men lived in close quarters with hundreds of others, sleeping in stacked bunks in compartments that sweltered in tropical heat. Fresh water was rationed for drinking and cooking, meaning showers were rare luxuries. The food was monotonous, the work exhausting, and the danger constant. Mail from home arrived irregularly, sometimes months old. Men went weeks without seeing land, surrounded by nothing but ocean and the other ships of their task force. In such an environment, a cat provided something precious: normalcy. Watching a kitten play with a piece of string, feeling the rumble of a purr, or having a warm furry body curl up in your lap during off-duty hours brought men back to memories of home, of peacetime, of a world where the primary concern wasn't whether tomorrow would bring a torpedo, a bomb, or a kamikaze. Pooli grew up surrounded by the rhythms of naval warfare. Her first memories would have been the constant vibration of the ship's engines, the clang of metal on metal, the voices of hundreds of men, and the smell of oil, paint, and the sea. As she grew from kitten to cat, she learned to navigate the ship with the sure-footedness that came naturally to felines. She knew which compartments were warm, which crew members would slip her treats, and where to hide when general quarters sounded and the ship prepared for action. The sailors doted on her. On a ship carrying over 1,000 men, Pooli had no shortage of attention. Off-duty sailors would spend hours playing with her, fashioning toys from scraps of line and fabric. The ship's cooks would save choice bits from a galley. Someone crafted her a bed from old canvas and rope. As Pooli grew, she became as much a part of the ship as the guns, the radar mast, or the boats hanging from their davits. But Pooli was not simply a pet. She was crew. She had a job, even if that job was simply being present, being alive, being something soft and innocent in a world of steel and violence. When exhausted men stumbled into their berthing compartments after 18-hour watches, Pooli would be there. When young sailors, many barely out of their teens, lay awake at night thinking about the battle to come, Pooli might jump onto their bunks and settle against them, a small warm weight that said without words that they were not alone. The attack transport on which Pooli served operated in the Central and Western Pacific during the period of her service. By mid-1944, the American advance was accelerating. The Marianas Campaign had just concluded with the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, operations that had cost thousands of lives. The Philippines loomed ahead, and with them the prospect of even larger, bloodier battles. Attack transports operated as part of task forces that could include dozens of ships, battleships and cruisers to bombard the beaches, aircraft carriers to provide air cover, destroyers to screen against submarines, and the transports themselves carrying the assault troops. The approach to a hostile shore followed a carefully choreographed sequence. Days before the landing, the transports would arrive at the staging area. The troops, who had been living in holds for weeks, would prepare their equipment, check their weapons, and attend final briefings. The night before D-Day, tension aboard ship would be palpable. Before dawn on the day of assault, the transports would move into position offshore. In the darkness, the crew would begin loading the landing craft. The LCVPs, or landing craft vehicle personnel, hung from davits along the transport's sides. These boats, nicknamed Higgins boats after their designer, could carry 36 troops or a small vehicle. Larger LCMs, or landing craft mechanized, carried tanks and artillery. Loading them was a complex operation requiring coordination between the ship's crew and the embarked troops. As the landing craft were loaded and lowered into the water, the bombardment would begin. Battleships and cruisers would open fire with their main batteries, hurling shells weighing as much as a small car toward the beaches. Aircraft from the carriers would strafe and bomb defensive positions. The noise was tremendous, a rolling thunder that went on for hours. Then the landing craft would form up in waves and head toward the shore. The transports would remain offshore, their crews watching through binoculars as the tiny boats disappeared into the smoke and spray. Radio operators would monitor the assault frequencies, listening to the terse reports from the beach. Sometimes the news was good, the landing unopposed or lightly defended. More often, the reports told of heavy fire, casualties mounting, boats destroyed before reaching the beach. This was when the transport crew's work truly began. Landing craft would return carrying wounded men, their decks slick with blood. The ship's medical staff would work frantically to save lives in the cramped sick bay. Other boats would bring requests for more ammunition, more troops, more supplies. The ship would continue loading and launching craft, a cycle that might continue for hours or even days. All the while, the ship remained vulnerable to air attack, shore battery fire, or submarines lurking beneath the waves. Pooli experienced all of this. During general quarters, when crew manned their battle stations, she would find a secure spot, perhaps in the radio shack or near the galley, somewhere she had learned was relatively safe. She heard the roar of the ship's anti-aircraft guns when Japanese planes attacked. She felt the shudder through the hull when bombs or shells landed near the ship. She smelled the acrid smoke of battle, the sharp chemical odor of burning aviation fuel, and the coppery scent of blood when wounded men were brought aboard. Cats have keen senses, far more acute than those of humans. Pooli would have detected changes in the ship's routine before the crew received official word. She would have sensed the tension in the air before an operation, the relief when the ship withdrew from a hostile shore, the grief when men who had fed her and played with her did not return from their duties. There is a photograph of Pooli, taken later in her life, showing her wearing a miniature naval uniform that some sailor carefully crafted for her. The uniform bore 3 service ribbons and 4 battle stars, the official recognition of her participation in combat operations. Those ribbons and stars represented specific campaigns and battles, each one a story of courage and sacrifice. The Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, with its distinctive ribbon of blue, yellow, and red stripes, was awarded to all personnel who served in the Pacific Theater. The battle stars attached to this medal represented participation in specific military operations. For battle stars indicated that Pooli's ship had been present at 4 major amphibious assaults or significant combat operations. While the exact operations remain unconfirmed in available records, the timeline of Pooli's service from mid-1944 onward coincides with some of the most significant campaigns of the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval battle in history. The landing at Leyte required over 700 ships, including scores of attack transports. For 4 days, American and Japanese fleets clashed in a series of separate engagements across hundreds of miles of ocean. Japanese commanders, knowing they faced defeat in the Philippines, threw everything they had into the battle, including launching the first organized kamikaze attacks. For the crews of the attack transports, the kamikazes represented a new and terrifying threat. Unlike conventional bombing, where aircraft released their weapons and turned away, kamikaze pilots aimed their entire aircraft at the target. Loaded with fuel and bombs, a successful kamikaze could inflict catastrophic damage. The transports, with their thin armor and decks crowded with troops and equipment, were particularly vulnerable. The first time Pooli's ship came under kamikaze attack would have been terrifying for humans and animals alike. The general quarters alarm would sound, sending the crew racing to their stations. The anti-aircraft guns would begin firing, their tracers arcing across the sky. Then would come the scream of aircraft engines at full throttle, growing louder, until it seemed the plane must be right overhead. The gunners would fire continuously, the barrels of their weapons glowing red-hot. Sometimes they would succeed in destroying the attacker before it reached its target. Sometimes they would not. If a kamikaze struck the ship, the impact would be devastating. The crash itself would tear through the superstructure. Then the aircraft's fuel and bombs would explode, starting fires that could spread rapidly through the vessel. Damage control parties would rush forward with hoses and firefighting equipment. Medical personnel would treat the wounded and dying. All around would be chaos, smoke, screaming, and the crackle of flames. Through all of this, Pooli survived. Whether through luck, instinct, or the protection of crew members who looked after her, she came through battle after battle unscathed. She became a symbol of survival, a living good luck charm for the crew. Superstitious sailors, and most sailors are superstitious, believed that as long as Pooli was safe, the ship would survive. The invasion of Luzon in January 1945 would have been another major operation. The landing at Lingayen Gulf involved nearly 800 vessels and over 200,000 troops. The kamikaze attacks during the Luzon campaign were particularly intense. Over the course of a week, suicide planes sank multiple ships and damaged dozens more. Attack transports, anchored in the Gulf while unloading troops and supplies, were sitting targets. Imagine Pooli's experience during such an attack. The ship would be at anchor, vulnerable and unable to maneuver. Alarms would sound. The crew would race to battle stations. In the compartment where Pooli sheltered, perhaps with a sailor or two who had stayed behind to comfort her, they would hear the guns firing, the engines of approaching aircraft, the near misses that sent up towers of water that drenched the deck. They would feel the ship rock from nearby explosions. They would smell smoke and cordite. And they would wait, hearts pounding, not knowing if the next moment would bring destruction. Between operations, there were periods of relative calm. The ship would withdraw to a rear area, perhaps Ulithi Atoll or another forward base, to resupply, make repairs, and give the crew some rest. These interludes were precious. Men could catch up on sleep, write letters home, and play cards or hold boxing matches on the deck. For Pooli, these were times to explore the ship more freely, to sun herself on deck, and to receive extra attention from sailors with time on their hands. The bond between Pooli and certain crew members would have deepened over months at sea. Cats are individuals with distinct personalities, and they form strong attachments to particular people. Surely Pooli had her favorites among the crew, men whose bunks she preferred, whose laps she sought out, who saved the best treats for her. These relationships were mutual. For young men far from home, facing death regularly, caring for Pooli gave them a sense of purpose beyond their military duties. She depended on them, and that dependency was a precious thing. As the war progressed through 1945, the nature of the fighting changed. The battles for Iwo Jima in February and Okinawa beginning in April were among the bloodiest of the entire war. The Japanese defenders, knowing these islands were among the last barriers between American forces and the Japanese home islands, fought with suicidal determination. The kamikazes intensified their attacks. At Okinawa, over 1,900 kamikaze sorties were flown against the American fleet. If Pooli's ship participated in either of these operations, she would have experienced combat at its most intense. Okinawa, in particular, dragged on for nearly 3 months, during which time the ships offshore came under almost continuous air attack. The strain on the crews was immense. Men stood watch after watch, slept in their clothes with life jackets on, and wondered each morning whether this would be the day their luck ran out. For Pooli, the accumulated stress of months of combat would have taken its toll. Cats may not understand war, but they respond to the emotions of those around them. The fear, exhaustion, and grief of the crew would have been palpable. Yet Pooli's presence also provided continuity and comfort. In the midst of industrial-scale killing, the simple act of petting a cat could remind a man of his humanity. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the relief must have been overwhelming. The war was over. The killing would stop. Men who had resigned themselves to dying in the invasion of Japan could now dare to hope they would see home again. Aboard the attack transports, the celebration would have been subdued but heartfelt. They had survived. For Pooli, the end of the war meant a change in routine, but not an immediate return to shore. The fleet remained in the Pacific for months, first supporting the occupation of Japan, then beginning the massive task of bringing millions of service members home. Attack transports, instead of carrying troops into battle, now carried them home, voyage after voyage, across the Pacific to California, the Panama Canal, and home ports on the East Coast. Eventually, Pooli's ship returned to the United States. The exact circumstances of her departure from naval service are not fully documented, but sometime after the war's end, Pooli found a new home in California. Perhaps she was adopted by a retiring crew member, someone who had bonded with her during the long months at sea and could not bear to leave her behind. Perhaps the entire crew petitioned to ensure she received a good home after her service ended. What is documented is that Pooli thrived in her post-war life. The photograph taken when she was 15 years old, wearing her tiny uniform with its ribbons and battle stars, shows a healthy, well-cared-for cat. Her transformation from ship's cat to civilian pet must have been significant. Instead of the constant motion and noise of a ship at sea, she would have experienced the stillness of a house on solid ground. Instead of hundreds of sailors, she would have had just a family. Instead of the smell of salt air and diesel fuel, the sense of a garden and a kitchen. Yet surely some part of her always remained a sailor. Cats have long memories. Did she ever startle at sudden noises, remembering the roar of guns? Did she seek out warm, enclosed spaces like the compartments where she had sheltered during general quarters? Did she form a particularly strong bond with her adoptive family, having learned aboard ship that humans were her protectors and companions? The decision to create a uniform for Pooli and photograph her wearing her decorations was significant. It represented formal recognition of her service, unusual for an animal. The 3 service ribbons and 4 battle stars were not symbolic gestures, but official acknowledgement that Pooli had been present during combat operations that met the criteria for these awards. She had served her country as surely as any sailor aboard her ship. The tradition of military animals being recognized for their service has deep roots. Horses carried cavalry into battle for millennia. Dogs have served as sentries, messengers, and mine detectors. Pigeons carried vital messages across battlefields. But cats, with their independence and insistence on choosing their own path, have always occupied a unique position. They were never trained for war. They simply found themselves present, and through their presence, they served. Pooli's decorations placed her in select company. Few animals have been officially recognized with military awards. Simon, a cat who served aboard HMS Amethyst during the Yangtze incident in 1949, was awarded the Dickin Medal, often called the Animal's Victoria Cross. Rip, a terrier who located survivors in bombed buildings during the London Blitz, received the same honor. But these were exceptional cases. Most animal veterans went unrecognized except in the memories of those who served with them. That someone took the time to create a proper uniform for Pooli, complete with accurate representations of her awards, and then to photograph her wearing it, speaks to the affection in which she was held. That photograph, preserved in the Los Angeles Times Photographic Archive, and now part of the UCLA Library's special collections, ensures that her story survives. Without that image, Pooli might have been forgotten, her service known only to the veterans who served alongside her. But photographs and records can only tell us so much. They cannot convey the warmth of her fur under a sailor's hand during a lonely night watch. They cannot capture the sound of her purr when she settled into someone's lap. They cannot recreate the moment when a frightened young sailor, hearing the general quarters alarm before his first combat operation, found comfort in stroking Pooli's soft coat and feeling her calm presence. These small moments of connection and comfort were Pooli's true service. In a war that killed millions, that destroyed cities and ships and lives, that asked young men to do terrible things in terrible places, Pooli represented something innocent and pure. She asked nothing but food and affection. She gave back companionship and a touch of normalcy. In the economy of war, where everything has a purpose and a function, Pooli's purpose was simply to be herself, a cat living her life among humans who needed her more than they knew. The Pacific War was vast in scale, stretching across a third of the globe, involving millions of combatants and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The great battles, the strategic decisions, the acts of heroism and sacrifice have been chronicled in thousands of books and films. But the experience of the individual sailor, the daily reality of life aboard a ship at war, is harder to capture. It is in the small details, the personal stories, the relationships between crew members, and even between crew members and a cat, that we find the human dimension of war. Pooli's story reminds us that war is not just about nations and ideologies, strategies, and tactics. It is about people living day to day, finding ways to endure and clinging to whatever brings them comfort and hope. A cat cannot understand why humans fight wars. She cannot comprehend the political causes or strategic objectives that sent ships across the Pacific into harm's way. But she could understand the individual humans who cared for her, who needed her, and who found in her presence a reminder of better times and better places. When Pooli died, presumably sometime in the early 1960s, given her age in the 1959 photograph, she would have been mourned by those who knew her. Her adoptive family would have grieved the loss of a beloved pet. Veterans who had served aboard her ship, scattered across the country, but perhaps still in touch through reunion associations, might have shared the news and remembered the gray tabby who had shared their wartime experience. What do you like about this animal? Tell me your favorite animal war story I should talk about next. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.